What psychological need drives a person to construct an entire false identity, only for that fabrication to become the very thing that triggers a desperate and violent act when it inevitably collapses? The killer wasn't just lying about his name. He was building a fantasy life to escape the decade-long criminal history. But when Lauren McClusky used her critical thinking skills and exposed his secret, his sophisticated lie didn't just end a relationship. It triggered a narcissistic injury so devastating it led to murder. Hi, good people. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Lauren McClusky case. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. What psychological need drives a person to construct an entire false identity, only for that fabrication to become the very thing that triggers a desperate and violent act when it inevitably collapses? When we look at the psychological profile of the perpetrator, Melvin Rowland, we are immediately confronted with a pattern of profound deception and manipulative narcissism that served as a primary operating mechanism. This wasn't just a simple lie. It was the creation of a sophisticated alternate persona, a crucial element for a man who had a decade-long criminal history. He was a registered sex offender, and he was on parole. He initially introduced himself to Lauren as a successful 21-year-old student and a track athlete at the University of Utah, not as Melvin Rowland, 37, but as a student named Sean Fields, claiming to be only 28 years old. This act of a grand deception is a compelling psychological indicator because it suggests that his underlying self-concept was so damaged or unacceptable that he required a complete fabrication to engage in a relationship. The true self, the convicted felon and parolee, was incompatible with the image he needed to project to gain access to a young woman like Lauren. He had to become a professional manipulator, spinning a plausible storyline to appear desirable, reliable, and trustworthy. The initial connection, meeting at a bar where he worked as a bouncer, was quickly cemented with a carefully constructed veneer of respectability, including claims of military service and security training. The depth of his manipulation became strikingly clear when he was interviewed by the parolee board on separate occasions, revealing his self-awareness of this deeply ingrained behavioral pattern. At a 2012 hearing, Rowland described himself as a very selfish, narcissistic man. It was all about me, and admitted to being attracted to and seeking to manipulate vulnerable women he met online or in person. This self-description of narcissistic and selfish behavior is a significant mental health indicator. It reveals an inability to genuinely connect or empathize where others are viewed only as objects to fulfill his needs. He saw the lie as a necessary tool, a calculated risk he was willing to take to acquire what he wanted, a relationship with a woman who represented a life far removed from his own criminal history. The facade, however, was fundamentally unsustainable, and the psychological fracture began the moment Lauren discovered the truth. Think about the psychological toll of being so fundamentally disconnected from your true identity that you create a fantasy, and then the devastating blow that occurs when that fantasy is stripped away, revealing the unacceptable self underneath. When Lauren used her critical thinking skills and discovered the truth, his real name, his actual age, and his status as a registered sex offender, she immediately ended the month-long relationship. For someone operating with a narcissistic framework and relying on manipulation, this rejection was not just a breakup. It was a devastating narcissistic injury, a profound challenge to his constructed reality and his self-control. This injury triggered a rapid and escalating pattern of psychologically abusive behaviors designed to reassert dominance and control over the one who exposed him. The first psychological manifestation of his loss of control was the calculated shift to extortion and harassment. Rowland initially borrowed Lauren's car and $1,000 for what he claimed were errands, but immediately following the breakup, the monetary demands became the core of his new campaign. He, or individuals Lauren believed were his friends, began sending her threatening and demanding messages, first falsely claiming Rowland was dead and that it was her fault, and then explicitly demanding money not to post compromising photos of the couple online. This psychological tactic of demanding payment to keep private photos secret is a classic maneuver of coercive control and sexual extortion, shifting the power dynamic from the relationship to a victim offender. Lauren's initial act of sending $1,000 was a response to this psychological pressure, a desperate attempt to protect her reputation and privacy. The deception became a complex web where Rowland would even pose as other individuals, communicating with Lauren from unknown numbers, while simultaneously texting her from unknown number, pretending to be upset that she was being harassed. This layer of duplicity and psychological gaslighting shows a complete lack of moral boundary and a focused intent to maintain emotional and financial control by creating confusion, fear, and a warped sense of shared victimhood. The question for us is, what deeper-seated psychological trauma might fuel this relentless need to dominate and control through lies, especially in the face of rejection? The known facts about the perpetrator's early life point to a significant psychological foundation of childhood abandonment and instability, which often correlates with later issues of attachment, impulse control, and manipulative behaviors. Court and parole records indicate that Melvin Rowland was adopted by an older couple in New York who both passed away while he was still young. He was subsequently moved to a state-run group home and later placed in a private boarding school. This early life history, characterized by the loss of his initial caregivers through death, followed by placement in impersonal institutional settings, suggests a profound and repeated experience of abandonment. From a psychological perspective, early traumatic abandonment can lead to a core belief that relationships are unreliable and that people inevitably leave. This can foster a coping mechanism centered on controlling others to prevent anticipated rejection, which manifests as the manipulation and deception we see in his adult behavior. His criminal history, which included pleas of guilty to enticing a minor over the internet and attempted forcible sexual abuse in 2004, and his repeated parole violations for internet sexual activity, point to an underlying issues of impulse control and sexual deviance. Parole board members repeatedly voiced concerns about Rowland's manipulative behavior and his inability to stop using the internet to meet women, a condition he himself attributed to an addiction to internet sexual activity. He often rationalized his actions as thinking errors, a psychological term sometimes used in correctional settings, but one that fails to capture the emotional depth of his pathology. This history reveals a man who, despite years of therapy and parole stipulations, could not overcome his compulsive drives, suggesting a deep-seated psychological rigidity and a lack of authentic empathy. The sudden rejection by Lauren was a direct threat to his fragile sense of self-worth and a traumatic echo of his earlier profound abandonment experiences, driving him to the ultimate horrific act of restoring absolute control. The escalation from psychological abuse and financial extortion to fatal violence in a matter of days is a chilling example of the psychological phenomenon known as intimate partner violence, driven by separation and control. His final actions show an intense, obsessive focus on restoring his dominion over Lauren, even after she had reported him to university police. Reports indicate that just days before the murder, Roland coerced a former coworker into lending him a gun, lying that he wanted to take Lauren target shooting. This premeditated act of acquiring a firearm is a crucial behavioral clue that points to a definite shift from mere extortion to the contemplation of violence, a clear psychological marker of escalating risk. His obsession was so palpable that the coworker later told police that Melvin was obsessed with Lauren and that she was all he could talk about. The day after the murder, on October 26, 2018, Roland spent hours lurking around Lauren's residence hall, a persistent and predatory presence on campus, waiting for the perfect opportunity to reestablish control. At 8:20 p.m., as Lauren was walking to her dorm and speaking to her mother on the phone, Roland confronted her. This timing, catching her off guard while she was engaged in a connection with her primary support system, was calculated to maximize her vulnerability. He violently dragged her into a waiting car and shot her 7 times, an act of extreme overkill violence that is often a psychological expression of rage, profound perceived betrayal, and the complete annihilation of the source of the narcissistic injury. This final fatal act was the ultimate expression of his need for absolute control, ensuring that if he could not possess her, no one could. A devastating psychological endpoint to his campaign of manipulation. The fact that he subsequently died by suicide is often seen in such cases as a final act of control, where the perpetrator, facing the imminent collapse of all defenses and the certainty of capture, chooses the only exit that preserves a final total illusion of power over his own destiny. The tragedy of this case is magnified by the failures of the systems Lauren trusted. She reported it and nothing seemed to happen. It stuck on the desk. But the psychological core lies in one man's need to create a false identity. Roland was a master manipulator. He manipulated everyone, including the authorities. It was a need so desperate that its exposure resulted in a relentless controlling pursuit that only ended with her death on his own terms. So what did she think about this case? I can only imagine what Lauren was going through when she first found out that Roland had lied to her, and the lies were big. His age, what he did, why he was there, all of it was a facade. And Roland had it all planned out. He had targeted Lauren. And he came up with all these stories, these elaborate stories, to be able to get access to her. And ultimately, unfortunately, by the time Lauren found out the truth, Roland did her in. He killed her. She was no longer able to defend herself. And this is a tragic story that happens so often when there's a dating relationship and you're caught off guard. Like she was at college. She had no idea that there would be a predator on campus. It happens so often. We are often unaware of our surroundings. And so when that happens, we let our guard down. And when we let our guard down, that's when the perpetrator offends. And that's when he gets in and does the abuse and the murder and all the other things that he wanted to do to Lauren. And Lauren was this innocent bystander. She didn't want her to be exposed, her name to be out there. She was successful. She had a whole future ahead of her. And she didn't want this incident to be the incident that defined who she was. And so she followed through. She paid the $1,000 extortion. And this was what happened. And it's a tragic case. And Roland is a tragic case as well. I'm not excusing his behavior, but if you think about Roland's history and his childhood and everything that he went through, we don't have all of the information. We don't have the reports, but we know historically when there are offenders and predators like Roland, something happened. He probably has some childhood trauma, and that is a tragic as well. Probably untreated, and it ended in the most horrific way, unfortunately. So were there any elements that stood out to you in this case? Let me know. And if you want more mental health analysis of true crime cases like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. If you found this case compelling, Be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe. See you tomorrow.